Mr. Colin Roberts, Director for Overseas Territories in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Your Excellency the Governor, Mr. Boyd McCleary, CMG CDO, Premier and Minister of Finance, the Honorable Ralph T. O'Neill, OBE, Deputy Premier and Minister for Health and Social Development, the Honorable Densey Ken, Minister for Communications and Works, the Honorable Julian Fraser, RA, 4th District Representative, the Honorable Vincent Scallard, public officers, media, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sandra Ward, and I'd like to welcome you to today's joint press conference with the Director of the Overseas Territories, the FCO, the Premier, and the Governor. We will first hear remarks from Mr. Roberts, who will speak to 3 main areas, and then followed by the Premier and the Governor, and then we'll take questions from the media. So at this time, I now invite Mr. Roberts to give his remarks.
I want to say thank you, Ministers, very much for coming along this morning. I'm afraid this is not going to be the most exciting press conference from what I have to offer, as I'm basically here in BVI on a routine visit, and I have no particular announcements to make, but I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have. But it just struck me that it might be useful if very briefly I say a little bit about the UK government's work on developing a new strategy towards the overseas territories in general. It's not specifically about the BVI, but obviously some aspects of the review will have implications for the British Virgin Islands. We still talk about a new government in the UK. The coalition government has not yet completed its first year in office, although it already feels that they've been there for a while. But as soon as they came into office in May last year, the Foreign Secretary made it clear that he wanted to review, as one of his priorities, the UK government's approach towards the overseas territories, where he had seen in opposition that there were a number of issues of concern. And we have been working with the Foreign Secretary and ministers in the Foreign Office and other government departments since then to go through these issues. The overseas territories are a very broad range of places around the world which throw up a very wide range of issues, some of which are, of course, very different and a long way from the issues of concern here in the British Virgin Islands. They include things like our need to defend and protect the community in the Falkland Islands, our involvement in British Antarctica, our involvement in the Indian Ocean, and the management of some major military bases around the world. And a number of decisions in relation to those issues have already been taken in the Strategic Defence Review, which was carried out in the course of 2010. But the point at which the review has reached now is that the UK government has concluded a number of very general principles in the way that it wants to approach the overseas territories. And it's perhaps best to describe them at the moment as 3 strands of thinking which will be developed further in the period ahead. The first strand is that the government feels that there has been a degree of sort of disengagement between the United Kingdom and the overseas territories. This government comes to it comes into office with a completely different set of attitudes towards the overseas territories. It is much more, I think, positive. It is much more instinctively supportive of the territories. And it has made it clear that it wants to live up to its responsibilities, just as it expects the territories themselves to live up to their responsibilities. But in a way that is really very different from the last administration in the UK, this coalition government does see the overseas territories as part of a global British community, and that attitude is very different. I think also their attitude towards issues of sovereignty is different from the previous administration in the UK. It has a much higher value for them, and their commitment to defending sovereignty for those territories where sovereignty is challenged by other countries is very clear and very robust. And the new approach to the overseas territories is, and you cannot emphasize this enough, is being taken against a background of enormous public service cuts in the United Kingdom. The cuts being made they've already started last year, but the 4-year period of cuts really began on the 1st of April, at the beginning of our financial year. These are the deepest cuts to public expenditure in the UK since the Second World War. And the sort of things that we're seeing is, on average, government departments in the UK are finding their budgets reduced by around 25%. In some departments, it is considerably deeper than 25%. So what the UK government can actually do, obviously, has to be seen against that public finance background. That being so, coming back, this first strand of the strategy to the overseas territories is to find ways of re-engaging with the overseas territories and opening doors between the territories and the UK. And a fundamental part of that, which is really the focus of work at the moment, is to reach a new agreement within the UK government that all government departments in the UK have a responsibility in their areas of expertise and competence to support with and work with the overseas territories. And over the past sort of decade or so, it's rather become the case that the Foreign Office, the Development, the DFID, the Development Ministry, and the Ministry of Defence have really taken on nearly all the work with the overseas territories. But we think it is important that all government departments open up doors to an engagement with the overseas territories where they have particular skills which are of potential use to the overseas territories. And there's a huge amount of detail in exactly how and what might be done under that strand. The second strand of thinking relates to governance and is frankly quite heavily driven by events in the Turks and Caicos Islands. The government is extremely concerned by the situation there and is determined that one, we must fix the problems in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and two, that it will never happen again, anything like that, in any other overseas territory. So they're looking very hard at the governance arrangements in all the territories. They will want to discuss with territory governments in the period ahead the arrangements which are currently in place. And also there will be a particular focus on the management of public finances in the overseas territories. And that discussion has already begun with a number of territories, including with the British Virgin Islands, where we have a very close, I think closer than for some time in the past, discussion over public finances here. So that's the second strand. And the third strand is that despite the background in public finances in the UK and the cuts that are going on there, the government has decided that it needs to invest greater resources in those territories which most need it. I'm afraid this is not an announcement about major transfers and support for the British Virgin Islands, which is by no means one of the poorer of the overseas territories. But this government has decided, for example, to go ahead with the construction of an airport in St Helena. St Helena has been on budgetary support for many, many years and would continue for indefinitely, requiring annual subsidies from the UK if it cannot develop a tourist industry. And so the decision to build an airport there has gone ahead. This airport will probably cost about £250 million sterling. It is a big project, but it is one that is founded on a sound business case for the long term. But a point there I want to stress is how politically significant it is in the UK that at a time of enormous public cuts and very large-scale redundancies in the UK public service, reductions to various kind of services made available to the UK public, that the government has nevertheless decided to go ahead with this very substantial project for a small and very dependent overseas territory. In the same way, the government has reviewed its engagement in Montserrat for many years since the territory was destroyed by a volcano. Montserrat has basically been on a kind of a life support, and this government wants to make the investments in Montserrat which will create a real possibility for Montserrat to have an economically independent future. And again, these are large-scale commitments. And the third major commitment made already, which has probably been reported here, is our intervention to underpin the bankruptcy of the Turks and Caicos Islands, which has been done through a rather complicated bit of financial engineering that essentially involves the UK government providing a loan guarantee to the Turks and Caicos Islands government in the sum of $260 million. On top of that, the Foreign Office has increased its grant support for the overseas territories. In the past year, we have increased that up to over £20 million sterling. Again, I'm afraid this is money that's going to those territories which are poorest and have been hit hardest. But the point I'm trying to make is that it is not just empty rhetoric from the government about wanting to provide greater support to the overseas territories. They have backed it up with decisions about the deployment of military assets, which are extremely expensive, and they've backed it up with a very, very substantial amount of economic and financial support. Going ahead, shortly there will be a decision within the British government confirming the arrangements between Whitehall departments, getting more departments involved in the overseas territories. And at that point, there will then begin a process of more detailed discussion and consultation with each territory, including with the British Virgin Islands, to try and define what are the aspects of the relationship which the British Virgin Islands wants to improve. What is the way in which the country here wants to engage better in more detail with the UK. And that consultation will go forward, and in due course, probably at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, there will be a white paper which will be this government, the coalition government's comprehensive statement of its relationship and its plans and policies towards the overseas territories. And that will include an enormous amount of detail, as I say, covering all the overseas territories and all the issues therein. Now, having said all that, I'm conscious that there's not a lot of that which is of direct relevance to the British Virgin Islands, and the basic reason for that is that BVI is seen as a very successful overseas territory, one that is managing its affairs well, and one which has weathered the global recession and the decline in financial services, the decline in tourism from North America, really rather better than many other independent states in the Caribbean, and rather better than most of the other overseas territories. So the BVI is basically a success story where it's a little bit harder for the UK to actually find ways in which we can practically help, since things here are being managed well. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't issues, particularly in relation to public finance. The British Virgin Islands has got a really difficult time. You've had a degree of recession here, and inevitably it's a particularly challenging period to manage government expenditure and raising government revenue. But I say this is basically a routine sort of discussion that we are having and will continue to have with the government of BVI. I haven't got anything else particularly to say at the outset, but I'm very happy to take questions on anything, and difficult questions will go to my right, and political questions will go to my left.
At this time, I thank you very much, Mr. Roberts. At this time, I'll invite the Premier to make his remarks.
Well, good morning again. It is nice to have Mr. Roberts here again in territory. I'm sure after his hospitable treatment in Anguilla, he will now enjoy the generosity of BVI also. I understand from him that the visit wasn't planned, so it was just come see and go. But whether it's a day or 2 days, it's nice to have him come and see what is going on in the BVI. He's director of the Overseas Territories Division, the FCO, so he at least got to come and see what the governor is doing. And I don't know if we are behaving so bad yet that he got to come to see what we are doing. But it's really nice to have Mr. Roberts and to talk over things and get a clear understanding of the situation in Great Britain at this time, and not there alone. The last one joined the club is Portugal, so I don't know who's next. God forbid it wouldn't be, I hope it wouldn't be the BVI. But in this difficult time worldwide, it teaches us all that we have got to be careful and make sure that we get value for money, and that the little money I have is not wasted. So we had a nice chat this morning about many things affecting the territory, and as time goes on, some of the things that we discuss now will mature, and the public will be informed of what is happening. I think that's all I would say. As I showed you, you're anxious to question Mr. Roberts and perhaps the governor too. So your customer hearing me, questioning me, and so I'll take a break now.
You're taking a break.
All right, thank you very much, Honourable Premier. So at this time, I will invite questions from the media and ask that you adhere to the protocol for this phase, that you stand, ask your questions, and you identify yourselves with the name of your media organization.
My name is Sam Lewis, ZBVI Radio. Mr. Roberts, some time ago when you visited the Virgin Islands, I believe it's in 2010, one of the issues that came up for discussion was one of governance. and he made some statements as regards the public finances of the Virgin Islands, and he made mention of the BVI need to balance the revenue and expenditure. Today, you made mention of governance again, and you're looking at the public finances. You also said that the BVI is a successful story. But tell us something about, from your last visit and what you saw with the public finances to now. Is there still a red flag flying, or has it been changed to green?
I'm trying to remember exactly the situation last time I was here, which was in January 2010. I think at that time it was clear that the public finances of all the Caribbean overseas territories had been hit very hard, and it was clear that it was going to be a struggle for all the territory governments to manage their public finances through the period ahead, which is sort of 2, 3, 4 years. And really from 2009, we've been having a much more detailed discussion with territory governments over the management of public finances to help them plan and prepare to deal with the potential drop in revenue and other fiscal challenges which were clearly emerging. And back in 2010, if I recall correctly, the focus of our discussions was on the need to, as you rightly said, make sure that expenditure and revenue were brought into balance, because I think at that time there was evidence that expenditure, without corrective action, expenditure in the BVI was going to rapidly outstrip revenue and create a growing deficit. So I say we've been working very closely with the government here since then, and we were very pleased that the government of BVI introduced a budget at the beginning of this financial year, which basically brought the public finances into balance. The BVI is still currently in breach of the liquid asset ratio in the borrowing agreement between the BVI government and the UK. But revenue has held up rather well here in BVI. And I think the focus now is, with the government's commitment to achieve and maintain balance through the planning of public finances in the budget, the focus now is, are there the right mechanisms in place in the way in which public finances are managed in the BVI that makes sure that the political decisions taken by the government in balancing the budget are actually implemented. Frankly, it's quite technical issues, but that is one of the aspects that we discussed this morning, and it's an aspect which my economic and finance specialists who were visiting in January this year looked at in some detail. And in terms of a flag, I would say it's not a red flag in BVI, it's not a green flag, but like many places around the world at the moment, it's an amber flag, basically meaning that if governments are not completely on top and committed to make sure that deficits don't expand, they could rapidly be in a very difficult situation, as the Premier has indicated a number of substantial countries have found themselves in.
As a backup, so it will be correct to say then, sir, that as Director of the Overseas Territory, you are satisfied with the mechanisms that have been put in place by the BVI government to address the whole issue of bringing a balance between expenditure and revenue. You can make a bold statement in that you are satisfied with the mechanisms put in place by the BVI government.
Well, the mechanisms are a slightly, as I say, a technical area. We are satisfied and very pleased at the budget itself that has been introduced here, because it's a budget that, on its figures, shows the BVI bringing its public finances into balance. as I say, it's not it's not a case of ticking a box and that is an end of the story. It's actually extremely difficult for a government to make sure that those commitments to constraining expenditure and raising revenue are actually translated into reality. The revenue actually has to be raised, the revenue projections have to be proved right, and where the government through its budget has said expenditure should be limited or should be in this amount in the next financial year, you sometimes find a situation that expenditure in practice increases. And there are many ways in which this can happen, but it's trying to make sure that that doesn't happen, as I say, which is the focus now. So it's not we were satisfied with the budget, and now we want to work with the government here to make sure that the budget is implemented and that expenditure doesn't outrun revenue through the course of the period ahead.
Mr. French.
About the French on the standpoint. You mentioned you didn't come here to announce any major thing that the UK government will be helping the BVI to do, but I want to ask about, have you received any requests for assistance from the BVI government? And I know the BVI is gearing up for elections in another couple of months. What assistance, what form of assistance will the UK be offering to the BVI and the borrowing guidelines? Could you say, is there a time frame you're looking to implement the borrowing guidelines, the new ones?
Yeah, I think if you mean the new borrowing guidelines, which we're calling a framework for fiscal responsibility. I mean, there isn't a deadline for that, and it's important that it's not made sort of caught up in the political process here. The matter of elections in BVI is entirely a matter for the territory. We don't get involved in the politics. But the areas on which we are working with the government of BVI are areas on which we would work with any government of the BVI, and really it is apolitical. It's about the management of public finances, I hope. I think it would be very good if the British Virgin Islands were the first of the territories to adopt a framework for fiscal responsibility, because I think it sends a very strong signal to the international business community that this is a place that has got its economy and public finances under control. In the UK, we were delighted at the very successful evaluation of the financial services industry here through some recent evaluations. And I think agreeing the frame responsibility on top of that would increase and strengthen the BVI's international reputation. So I think there's an opportunity to do it, and I hope it can be done fairly soon. But again, these are technical issues that we need to work through and make sure that we understand. And it is something that's primarily meant to benefit any government of the BVI.
Malika McPherson, the Island Sun newspaper. Sir, in your opening remarks, you mentioned a number of areas and means in which the new government is trying to include overseas territories. How would this translate for the BVI? In what areas, especially as it relates to small territories like the BVI, do you think this new agreement and new structure, I should say, stance would assist in helping to achieve certain areas that we may have concerns with?
Well, I think we're not really at a sufficiently advanced stage in the process to identify specific things for specific territories. I can only say that we hope to be getting into a more detailed discussion with the British Virgin Islands to identify what are the areas. I mean, one thing I would mention, it's I would say we're very open-minded on what kind of thing each individual territory is looking for. And I'll just mention one thing, which I mean, the Premier may know more about than I do, but the British Virgin Islands government is developing a partnership agreement with Hertfordshire County Council in the UK, which was initially a sort of I think linked to the BVI's Olympic team in the UK, but it's moved on to include some educational and health care issues. We have the UK central government, the Foreign Office and my ministers are extremely interested and supportive of this, and if there are any sort of obstacles in pursuing this kind of cooperation, which is in the interests of both the County Council in the UK and of the BVI, we would be ready to intervene with the County Council to encourage them to and help them, resolve any difficulties. At the moment, there aren't any difficulties, but it's an example where, on the initiative of the territory, the BVI, they have seen something within the UK that is of value to them, and so what we're trying to do is just make sure those doors are open and all the people who are involved in those decisions understand that there is a special relationship between the UK and the overseas territories. But I'll just go on with one other aspect of the strategy is the government will be trying to do more to make not just the people in government in the UK but the broader community in the UK more aware of and supportive of the overseas territories. Because the reality is that there's a lot of work to do, I think, to get the UK to understand the overseas territories better.
Mr. Roberts, you are visiting the BVI at a very crucial time to discuss these issues to which you are here for, but there are also a number of discussions taking place in the BVI on certain issues. One of it relates to the letter from you, sir, a letter written by you from the former Foreign and Commonwealth Office to the Premier, that ended up in the hands of the public domain. An investigation was carried out and was unable to determine what happened. Is this a concern for you, sir, as Director of the Overseas Territories and for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where confidentiality is concerned and security also? If so, could you tell me please, sir?
I think it's a pity that a private communication between me and the Premier should come into the public domain. It's not for me to comment on the internal security arrangements in government. The Governor may want to say something about that. But on the substance of the issue, it doesn't cause me a difficulty that this letter has come into the public. We are nowadays required under the Freedom of Information Act in the UK to make a huge amount of documentation public. This was not a document that was formally classified. It didn't have confidential stamped on it. It was more sort of private rather than formally confidential. And it's now in the public domain. It doesn't cause the UK government a difficulty, but perhaps the Governor might want to just comment on the security.
Well, as you know, I did conduct an investigation, or I asked Elton George to conduct an investigation into what happened. He wasn't able to establish precisely what happened. There were too many people saw the document because as Mr. Roberts has explained, it wasn't actually marked confidential, restricted, therefore it was fairly widely circulated in the Premier's office. I was concerned that a document which was private in nature had leaked into the public domain, and we certainly were taking steps to try and ensure that doesn't happen in the future.
Does it remain a concern for you still, sir, where a letter from the FCO to the Premier? There must be something as regards confidentiality, the breach of confidentiality, in terms of what other steps the FCO is likely to take. It must be a concern to you where a letter to the Premier, first time it has happened, ended up in the hands of the public without public first seeing the Premier. It must be a concern to you and the FCO. What you like to see done, or probably what went through your mind when that happened, or what was reported to you?
I think that, in this particular case, as I say, it wasn't what we call a classified document, so it hasn't raised major concerns. The issue about it leaking within BVI is a matter for the BVI government. Obviously, we've thought, were it a confidential document that actually was damaging to either the UK's or the BVI's fundamental interest to get into the public domain, then indeed we would be concerned. But it wasn't that kind of a communication.
All right, I'll take 2 more questions.
All right, Mr. Roberts, I just want to address the contents of the letter, actually. What assurances have you received from the BVI government that the contents contained in the letter are being addressed? Specifically, the need, I think it was, I can't remember exactly what the letter says right now, but specifically it relates to taking the fiscal approach to remedy.
Finance recording standards.
Yes, something to do with finance, ensuring that the finances are taken care of. Could you say what assurances have you received from the BVI government that?
Yeah, well, I think if you'll forgive me, we have a general rule in the UK that when documents have come into the public domain through a leak, that we don't comment on the substance of them. That it is a private communication between us and the government, and I'd like to keep it that way.
Okay, 1 more question.
All right. In relation to the issue of the contents, specifically the company involved, the governor had said that he doesn't see a need for an inquiry right now. But the opposition parties have been calling for an inquiry. Could you say what steps have been taken at the FCO to address their concerns, if any at all?
The governor has informed us of we're aware of the requests, particularly the request to have a commission of inquiry here. We understand and support the governor's reasons for concluding that this is not a matter for a commission of inquiry. However, there are other forms of assurance available and operating effectively within the government of the BVI, and I'm sure the governor will make sure that those are engaged in the proper way.
Just the last one.
Mr. Roberts, let's get back to that letter. Is it a normal procedure, sir, right? The situations where a government appears to have a contingent liability in the case with the Bywater issue, and in relation to the letter written by you to the government as regards this contingent liability, would you advise the government then, sir, to take this issue to the House of Assembly where it can be voted on and a decision made? Would you advise the government on that?
I wouldn't advise the government on a matter like that, because that's a matter for the government.
What do you say, sir, as
Just a
related
minute,
to this
Sam.
matter?
I'm sorry, but we're going to have to.
But if I may, Ms. Wall, the letter, as I understand it, it said it appears. He didn't say it is so, and he must do so and so. He said it appears, and he made a suggestion. I think that's quite different from categorical stating so.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's all the time we have for today's press conference. As we end, though, I don't know if Mr. Roberts just wanted to make any closing remarks. Then I can just wrap it up.
No, simply to say thank you, representatives of the media for coming along. And I remember last time that most of the questions came from our colleague there, and it always makes the press conferences more interesting, so thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That concludes our press conference for today, and have a pleasant day. Thank you.